The moving truck was still parked in the driveway when he noticed it. Curtains shifting, eyes watching. People slowing their steps as they walked their dogs, staring just a second too long before looking away. Not one smile. Not one friendly welcome to the neighborhood, just silence. He had dreamed about this house for years. A 2-story brick home with a porch that wrapped around the front, a yard wide enough for cookouts, and a quiet street lined with tall trees. It was the kind of place people worked a lifetime to get, and now after years of saving, it was his. It should have been the start of something good. But even as he carried boxes through the front door, there was this heavy feeling that he was already being judged. The next morning, before he even finished his first cup of coffee, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, firm, the kind of knock that didn't wait for an answer. He opened it and found a woman standing there. Mid-60s, neatly dressed, pearl earrings, her cardigan pinned with a shiny badge that read Homeowners Association. Her name was Barbara. She didn't smile, didn't offer a welcome. She introduced herself as the president of the HOA, then immediately handed him a thick stack of papers. "These are the rules," she said in a clipped tone. "We like to maintain a certain standard here." He looked at the papers, then back at her. He tried to be polite, tried to smile, but she was already glancing past him into the house, scanning it like she owned the place. Finally, she pointed at the moving truck in the driveway. "That needs to be gone by this evening," she said. Her voice wasn't a request, it was an order. He nodded slowly, explaining he was still unpacking and would take care of it. She gave a stiff nod, but her eyes said something else. Not approval, not kindness. Something colder, like she was making a note in her mind. And just like that, she turned and walked away. No welcome to Brentwood Estates, no neighborly small talk. Just rules, conditions, and a message she didn't need to say out loud. "You don't belong here." He closed the door and exhaled. Maybe she was just one of those strict HOA types, the kind who lived to enforce tiny details. He decided not to let one woman ruin his fresh start. He went back to unpacking, telling himself things would settle down. But the truth was already clear. He hadn't just bought a house. He had stepped into a place where every move would be watched, judged, and challenged. Over the next few days, the feeling grew stronger. He noticed how neighbors stood in small groups, whispering as he walked by. How conversations went quiet the second he appeared. How smiles were tight and forced, never reaching their eyes, and then the papers started showing up. At first, it was a warning about a car in the driveway, his car. Then a notice about the lawn, even though it was barely an inch higher than anyone else's. Another about a porch light that had been there since before he moved in. Each time he opened the mailbox, there was another folded notice sealed with the HOA stamp. Each time the message felt the same: "We don't want you here." Still, he stayed calm. He stacked the letters in a drawer, refusing to let them shake him. But deep down he knew this wasn't about lawns or lights or cars. It wasn't about rules at all. It was personal, and as much as Barbara thought she was in control, she had no idea who she was dealing with, because the man she was trying to push out, the one she thought didn't belong, wasn't just another homeowner. He was the legal owner of the very house she thought gave her power, and soon she was going to learn that her rules, her intimidation, and her little stack of violation letters couldn't change that truth. For now, though, he stayed quiet. He let her think she had the upper hand. He watched. He listened. He kept his cool. But as he shut the drawer full of notices and looked around at the home he had worked so hard to buy, one thought settled in his mind. This isn't just a neighborhood. This is a battlefield, and Barbara has no idea she's already lost. The morning after Barbara's first visit, he told himself it would get better. Maybe she was just having a bad day. Maybe once people saw he took care of his property, they would relax. But that hope didn't last long. On the third day in his new home, he opened the mailbox and froze. Inside was a neatly folded paper stamped with the HOA logo. It was his first violation notice. The reason? An unauthorized vehicle in the driveway. He frowned. The so-called unauthorized vehicle was his own car, parked exactly where it should be. He crumpled the paper in his hand, then forced himself to smooth it out again. Getting angry wouldn't help. He tucked it away in the drawer with the HOA guidelines and tried to brush it off. But the following morning, another letter appeared. This one accused him of improper lawn maintenance. He stepped outside, scanning his yard. The grass had grown maybe an inch since moving day, but it was far from overgrown. He had walked past houses on the same street with weeds sprouting up between cracks, with hedges untouched for months. Yet somehow his lawn was the problem. By the end of the first week, he had collected 4 notices. 1 for the car, 1 for the lawn, 1 for the porch light being too bright, another for leaving his trash bin out too long even though he had pulled it in the same evening. He couldn't help but notice the trash bins still lined up in front of his neighbors' houses the next morning. No letters in their mailboxes, no warnings on their doors. Every time he walked through the neighborhood, the silence weighed heavier. Small groups of neighbors would gather in driveways, laughing and talking until they saw him. Then, like clockwork, the conversations died. Faces turned away. Some pretended to be busy with their phones. Others offered half smiles, tight and polite as if to say, "We see you, but we don't welcome you." One evening, he passed a group standing around a shiny SUV. Barbara was in the center, arms crossed, her pearl earrings catching the last bit of daylight. She leaned toward the others, whispering. Heads nodded. Eyes glanced at him before quickly darting away. He didn't need to hear the words. He already knew. He reminded himself not to take it personally. Maybe this was just how the HOA worked. Maybe Barbara was this strict with everyone. But that belief shattered when he started paying closer attention. On his morning walks, he noticed lawns taller than his, hedges spilling into sidewalks, faded shutters hanging crooked on houses, and porch furniture that looked like it had survived 2 decades of storms. Not a single one of those homes had violation slips tucked under their doors. Not one, it was only him. Always him. He tried to keep his cool. After all, he had worked too hard for this house to let petty complaints chase him away. Still, the unfairness gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the thought that Barbara was watching his every move, waiting for any excuse to write him up. And then came the visit that changed everything. Late one afternoon, as he was sweeping the porch, Barbara appeared again. She didn't knock this time. She simply stood at the bottom of his steps, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and unblinking. He set the broom aside and walked toward her, forcing a calm smile. "Something I can help you with?" he asked. Barbara cleared her throat and lifted the form clipped to her board. "This is a formal request," she said evenly. "We'll need proof of home ownership." He blinked. "Proof? Why?" "There have been complaints," she replied. "Different cars coming and going, deliveries at odd hours. Some neighbors are concerned you may be renting in violation of HOA rules." He let out a short laugh, more out of disbelief than humor. "I own this house," he said firmly. "I've lived here less than a month. Of course I've had deliveries, I'm moving in. And those cars, family, friends helping me get settled." Barbara's expression didn't soften. If anything, her lips pressed tighter. "We like to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted," she said. "Submitting a copy of your deed will settle the matter quickly." His jaw tightened. He knew exactly what this was. None of his neighbors had been asked to prove they owned their homes. Only him. "You can look it up yourself," he replied evenly. "It's public record." Barbara's eyes narrowed. For a second her mask slipped and the annoyance showed. But she quickly straightened, pasting on a stiff smile. "I'd prefer if you submitted it directly. And if I don't?" he asked. Her voice was sugar-sweet, but her eyes were cold. "Then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the board." He felt the anger rising in his chest, but he swallowed it back. That was exactly what she wanted, for him to snap, to raise his voice, to give her something to use against him. Instead, he smiled. "I'll think about it," he said, and with that, he closed the door. Behind it, he let out a long breath. She was pushing harder now, crossing lines she had no business crossing, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. Because while Barbara thought she was building a case against him, he was quietly building one against her. Barbara's request for proof of ownership wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. From that moment on, things began to escalate in a way that felt less like neighborhood rules and more like a personal attack. 2 mornings after she demanded the deed, another letter appeared in his mailbox. This one accused him of failing to remove his trash bins in a timely manner. He laughed out loud when he read it. He had pulled the bins in the same evening as pickup, no later than anyone else. Out of curiosity, he took a slow walk around the neighborhood the next morning. What he saw made his blood run hot. Dozens of trash cans were still lined up at the curb. Some lids hung open, stuffed with overflowing bags. Others had been tipped over by the wind, spilling trash onto the street, and yet not a single violation notice on any of them. Not one, so it was official now. He wasn't just imagining things. Barbara had chosen him, and she wasn't going to stop. Instead of reacting, he pulled out his phone and snapped photos. Each one time-stamped, each one clear. He sent them to the HOA board in a polite email, asking why his bins were an issue while others were ignored. No reply, just silence, but 2 days later Barbara was back. She didn't knock this time. She stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, clipboard pressed tight against her chest. Her expression was sharp, like a hawk circling prey. He stepped outside, keeping his voice calm. "Can I help you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved past him, scanning the porch, the windows, even the car parked neatly in the driveway. Finally, she lifted her clipboard. "We've received more concerns," she said, her tone clipped. "Your property continues to draw attention. Neighbors have noticed unusual activity." He tilted his head. "Unusual activity?" "Furniture deliveries at odd hours. Different cars coming and going." She paused, letting her words hang heavy in the air. "It doesn't look like you're establishing a stable residence. It looks temporary." Her words stung, not because they were true, but because he could see where she was trying to push him. She wanted to paint him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't fit their standard. "I already told you," he said evenly. "I own this house. Deliveries are because I'm still moving in. Visitors are family. Nothing unusual about that." Barbara's lips curled into a thin smile. "Then you'll have no problem providing official documents. We'll need a copy of your deed. The board requires it." He crossed his arms, staring at her without blinking. "If you need proof, check the county records. That's your job, not mine." Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. The smile still plastered on her face, but her eyes gave her away. She wasn't used to being challenged. She was used to people bowing their heads and doing whatever she demanded. "If you refuse to comply," she said finally, "the board will have no choice but to escalate this matter further." He could feel the heat rising in his chest. He wanted to tell her exactly what he thought of her rules, her attitude, and her so-called authority. But he stopped himself. He remembered the way she lingered on his porch waiting for him to explode. That was what she wanted. She wanted him to be the angry neighbor, the problem, the one she could point to and say, "See? He doesn't belong here," so instead he smiled, calm, steady. "Do what you have to do," he said. And then without another word he turned and went back inside, closing the door firmly behind him. Barbara didn't move right away. Through the blinds he saw her standing there for a moment longer, her posture stiff, her jaw tight. Then slowly she walked away. That night he sat on his porch with a notebook in his lap. Enough was enough. If she wanted a game, he would play it, but on his terms. He started jotting down everything he had seen around the neighborhood. Broken fences, overgrown yards, chipped paint, trash bins left out for days. Each one carefully recorded, each one ready to be documented with photos. For weeks, Barbara had been watching him. Now he decided it was his turn to watch her, and the rest of the neighborhood too. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he leaned back in his chair, feeling a new kind of calm settle in. Barbara thought she had him cornered. She thought she could drown him in rules and notices until he gave up. But what she didn't realize was that he wasn't the type to fold. The next round wouldn't be hers. It would be his. The next morning he woke up earlier than usual. The sun was barely over the rooftops when he grabbed his phone and started walking down the street. This wasn't just a casual stroll anymore, this was reconnaissance. He moved slowly, stopping at each house. He didn't have to look far to see violations. One neighbor's lawn stretched like wild grass, easily a foot high. Another had shutters dangling by one hinge, rattling in the breeze. A few doors down, a bright blue mailbox stood out like a sore thumb, completely ignoring the uniform black ones listed in the HOA's handbook. And everywhere, trash bins. Lids open, bags spilling, cans still sitting on the curb long after collection. He took pictures of everything. Each one time-stamped, each one clear. If Barbara wanted to play the rules game, then fine. He'd play by the rules too, only better. Back at home, he typed up a report. Polite, professional, no anger, no accusations, just a list of violations backed with undeniable proof. Then, with one click, he sent the email to the entire HOA board. 2 days later, Barbara was at his door again. This time she didn't bother with fake politeness. She stood with her clipboard pressed tight against her chest, lips pursed so firmly they were nearly white. "We received your list," she said sharply. "Good," he replied calmly. "Then you know I'm not the only one breaking rules." Her eyes narrowed. "The board decides which issues warrant action. Not every infraction requires a formal notice." He tilted his head, studying her. "Funny, mine do." Every single time, her nostrils flared. For a moment, her mask slipped and he could see it. Frustration, maybe even panic. She was used to being the hunter. Now, for the first time, she was being hunted. The very next morning, another violation letter arrived. This one claimed his porch furniture didn't meet neighborhood aesthetic standards. He laughed out loud. His set was simple but new. 2 wicker chairs and a glass table. He had seen neighbors with faded plastic chairs that had been sitting out since the early 2000s. Nobody had bothered them. But him? Always him. By the following day, yet another notice showed up, this time for his lawn. The same lawn he had just mowed, edged, and watered. It looked cleaner than half the yards on his block, but Barbara had filed a formal complaint saying it was overgrown. He sat at his kitchen table, violation letter in hand, and shook his head. This wasn't about furniture or lawns or lights. Barbara was trying to drown him in paper, to bury him in complaints until he cracked. But instead of breaking, he doubled down. That evening, he walked the neighborhood again, this time with a notebook and camera in hand. He documented everything: trash bins still out, weeds climbing up fences, cracked paint, faded house numbers. Each one neatly written down, each one captured in photos. When he got home, he compiled another email. Longer this time. Detailed. He included the pictures, the addresses, the specific violations copied word for word from the HOA guidelines. Then he hit send. Less than 24 hours later, Barbara returned. But this time she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was another board member, a tall man with graying hair and a clipboard of his own. His name was Stephen Reynolds, the vice president of the HOA. Barbara tried to keep her tone professional, but her voice was tight. "We appreciate your enthusiasm in monitoring the community," she said. "But your behavior is becoming disruptive." "Disruptive?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. "I'm just following the rules." "Isn't that what you asked of me?" Stephen cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We reviewed your complaints. While we understand your concerns, not all minor issues warrant official notices." He crossed his arms, fixing his gaze on Barbara. "So when it's my porch light, it matters, but when it's my neighbor's broken shutters, it doesn't?" "Interesting." Barbara stiffened. Stephen shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her before looking back at him. For the first time, there was doubt on the board's side, a tiny crack in the armor Barbara had built. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the words sharp. "Tell me something. If I were someone else, say one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Silence. Barbara's jaw tightened, her face flushing red. Stephen opened his mouth, hesitated, then shut it again. There was no good answer. Finally, Barbara shoved a printed form into his hand. "This is your final warning," she snapped. "Replace the furniture. Maintain your lawn to regulated standards, or fines will follow." He looked down at the paper, then back at her. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. Not a smile of surrender, but one of certainty. "You know," he said evenly, "I've read those bylaws from start to finish. Nowhere does it say a homeowner must replace furniture that's in perfect condition. Nowhere does it say my lawn has to meet your personal opinion of regulated length." Barbara's eyes flashed. For the first time, she looked unsettled. Stephen shifted again, visibly uneasy. He wasn't fully on Barbara's side anymore. He could see the cracks, and that's when it hit him. Barbara might have power, but it was fragile, paper thin, and all it would take was the right push to tear it apart. As she turned on her heel and marched down the driveway, he folded the notice in half and slipped it into his pocket. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even frustrated. He was ready because this wasn't Barbara's game anymore. It was his, and soon everyone was going to see it. Barbara had always played with paper, violation slips, warning letters, little notes tucked into mailboxes. But when those didn't break him, she raised the stakes. One morning, he opened his mailbox and found something different. No HOA stamp this time. Instead, a thick envelope with the name of a law firm printed across the top. His stomach sank as he tore it open. Inside was a formal complaint filed with the county housing authority. The accusation? that he was living in the home illegally, that he wasn't the rightful owner, that he was renting the property under false pretenses. For a long moment he just stared at the paper, his hands tightening around it. It wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was Barbara trying to erase him from his own house. But instead of fear, a calm settled over him. Because while Barbara thought she was clever, she didn't know the whole story, and soon, she was going to regret underestimating him. That evening, he picked up the phone and called his attorney, an old friend who had guided him through every real estate deal he'd ever made. Barbara's finally overplayed her hand, he said, sliding the papers across his desk. It's time we make this official. 3 days later, an emergency HOA board meeting was called. Word spread fast, and by the time he arrived, the room was packed. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, their whispers buzzing like a hive. Some looked curious. Others looked uncomfortable. A few wouldn't even meet his eyes. At the head of the long table sat Barbara, her posture stiff, her pearl earrings gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To her left and right were the other board members, including Stephen, who looked uneasy, flipping through his notes. Barbara shuffled her papers and cleared her throat. We are here tonight, she began, her voice crisp, to address the ongoing violations and concerns regarding Mr. Patterson's residence. He didn't wait for her to finish. He stood sliding a stack of his own papers onto the table. His voice was steady, calm, but carried through the room. Before you go any further, I'd like to respond. Barbara's lips thinned. You'll have your turn. No, he cut in firmly. I'm speaking now. A murmur spread through the crowd. Barbara looked ready to explode, but she forced herself into silence, gesturing stiffly for him to continue. He picked up the first document and held it high. This, he said, is the deed to my home. Filed, recorded, legal. Proof that I am the rightful owner of the property you've accused me of occupying illegally. A few people in the crowd leaned forward, squinting at the paper. The room shifted. Barbara's smile faltered. He set the deed down and picked up another paper. This is the purchase agreement for 214 Oakwood Drive, closed and complete. He paused, letting the address hang in the air. Some heads turned toward Barbara, confusion flickering across their faces. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lifted the final document. And this, he said, his voice tightening just enough for impact, is the deed for 216 Oakwood Drive. Barbara's house. The silence that followed was heavy. A few gasps rippled through the room. All eyes darted between him and Barbara, whose face drained of color. He didn't sit down. He wanted the weight of the moment to settle. The same woman who has tried for weeks to push me out of this neighborhood, he continued, is now discovering that her own house belongs to me. Barbara's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands trembled around her papers. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, How? You might want to check the HOA records you ignored, he replied coolly. The foreclosure you brushed aside. The auction you pretended wasn't happening. I was the buyer. Gasps turned into whispers. Some neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked at Barbara with something close to pity or maybe shame, but he wasn't finished. He placed another paper on the table. And let's not forget this. The fraudulent eviction attempt you filed against me. You accused me of being an illegal occupant. You dragged my name through legal filings without a single shred of proof. He turned, his gaze locking on Barbara. Would you care to explain why? Her lips quivered. Several residents expressed concerns. Who? He snapped, cutting her off. She froze. I am not at liberty to... No names, he said firmly. Because no one came forward. No one remembers expressing those concerns, which means you made it up. The whispers grew louder. Some neighbors shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Barbara's composure was cracking. He pressed on. You accused me of violating policies, yet ignored countless real violations I submitted. Overgrown yards, broken fences, trash bins sitting out for days. Rules that apply to everyone. But you only enforced them against me. Stephen cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. For the first time, he looked directly at Barbara. Is this true? Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. The silence in the room was louder than any words. Finally, he leaned back, folding his arms. This was never about rules. This was about one person deciding who she thinks belongs here. But the truth is simple, I do belong. And the one who's been breaking the rules all along is you. The room erupted in low murmurs, some neighbors nodding, others shaking their heads. Barbara sat frozen, her face pale, her authority slipping away by the second. For weeks she had tried to paint him as the outsider, but now in front of everyone she was the one exposed, the president of the HOA caught in her own web of lies. And for the first time since moving in, he felt the balance shift. The battle wasn't over yet, but the power had changed hands. The silence after his last words was deafening. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Board members shuffled papers they weren't even reading. And Barbara sat frozen at the head of the table, her knuckles white as she gripped her clipboard. For weeks she had thrown every petty rule and threat at him, but now, under the bright lights of the community room, she had nothing. He didn't rush. He let the silence stretch until it felt heavy, until everyone in the room understood the shift. Then slowly he laid one more paper on the table. This, he said, tapping the document, is a record of unpaid HOA fees tied to the property at 216 Oakwood Drive, Barbara's house. A collective gasp swept through the room. Some neighbors leaned forward, others turned toward Barbara with wide eyes. Her face flushed red, and for the first time her polished mask cracked. That's not true, she stammered. Oh, it's true, he said calmly. When I bought your house at auction, I inherited the debts attached to it. Which means, Barbara, you owe more than $3,000 in unpaid fees to the very HOA you claim to run so tightly. The whispers turned into open chatter now. A man in the back shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Another woman crossed her arms, glaring at Barbara like she was seeing her for the first time. Stephen, the vice president, leaned forward to scan the document, his brows furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Barbara, is this correct? Her jaw clenched. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally said, "Those fees are disputed." "No." Stephen cut her off, his voice firmer than anyone had ever heard it. "They're recorded, which means you've been targeting a homeowner for violations while ignoring your own." The room buzzed again. People shook their heads, exchanged whispers, some even chuckled under their breath. The Queen of Order, the woman who prided herself on catching every tiny detail, had been caught ignoring the biggest violation of all, her own. He leaned back slightly, his voice steady, almost gentle, but carrying more weight than any raised shout. "So tell me, Barbara, how do you plan to enforce rules on others when you can't even follow them yourself?" Her face burned crimson. She fumbled with her papers, shoving them into her folder, but the damage was done. Then, from the back of the room, an older man's voice broke through. "This is a disgrace." All eyes turned to him, Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents. He shook his head slowly, his disappointment cutting deeper than anger. "You tried to evict the man who owns your house. You've embarrassed all of us." The murmurs grew louder. Laughter bubbled up here and there, the kind that stung more than outright insults. Barbara's shoulders stiffened. She tried to regain control, slamming her folder shut. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, her voice shaking. But Stephen didn't move. Neither did the rest of the board. Instead, Stephen cleared his throat. "No, Barbara. Not yet." She froze, staring at him like he'd betrayed her. "Excuse me?" "We need to vote," Stephen said carefully. "The bylaws are clear. If an officer is found abusing their authority, the board can remove them." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Barbara's mouth fell open. "You can't," but he cut her off again, his tone firm. "We can and we should." Hands began to rise, hesitant at first, then more confident. Neighbors who had once stood silently by now lifted their arms one by one. Lisa Hendricks, the woman from 3 houses down, raised hers with a quiet, "Seconded." Barbara spun around, her eyes darting wildly across the room. "You don't understand. Everything I did was for the good of this community." But no one was listening anymore. The tide had turned. Stephen looked around the table, then back at her. "By majority vote," he said slowly, almost solemnly, "Barbara Whitman is hereby removed as president of the Brentwood Estates HOA, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Barbara's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her face, once the picture of control, now showed only shock and fury. She shoved back her chair and stood abruptly, her heels clicking against the tile as she stormed toward the exit. But for the first time, no one followed her. Neighbors leaned back in their chairs, murmuring to each other, some even smiling with relief. The spell she had held over them had been broken. He gathered his papers slowly, methodically, not needing to say another word. He had done what she never expected. He had beaten her not with anger, not with threats, but with truth. And as he walked out of that room, he could feel it. The weight shifting, the balance changing. Barbara had built her power on fear and control, but in a single evening it had crumbled around her. She wasn't just dethroned. She was finished. But deep down, he knew Barbara wasn't the kind of person to let go quietly. And as much as this victory felt good, something told him the battle wasn't over yet. The night of the HOA meeting changed everything. For weeks, Barbara had ruled with sharp eyes and endless notices, her voice carrying more weight than it deserved. But now her voice was gone. Her authority stripped away in front of the very people she thought she controlled. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt different. The tension that once hung in the air started to fade little by little. Without Barbara at the helm, the HOA board began addressing real issues instead of nitpicking over porch lights or trash bins. They fixed broken fences, discussed new landscaping projects, and even organized a small community cleanup day. For the first time since moving in, he felt like the neighborhood was actually being cared for instead of being ruled. Still, not everyone changed overnight. Some neighbors continued to avoid his gaze, embarrassed by their silence during Barbara's reign. Others whispered in hushed tones, still uneasy about the whole ordeal. But a few began to step forward. One afternoon, as he trimmed the hedges in his yard, Lisa Hendricks from 3 houses down walked up the driveway. She held a plate of cookies awkwardly, her smile nervous but genuine. "I should have done this sooner," she admitted, handing the plate to him. "Welcome to the neighborhood." He chuckled softly, accepting the plate. "Took you long enough." Lisa laughed, a little sheepish. "Yeah, it did. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A start." Meanwhile, Barbara's downfall was far from over. Losing the HOA presidency had been humiliating enough, but the reality of her situation hit harder when she realized she no longer owned the very house she lived in. She and her husband tried to negotiate, offering him the same amount he had paid at auction. He shook his head calmly. "That's not how real estate works. If you want it back, it'll be at market value." Barbara's face had twisted with outrage. To her, it must have felt like insult piled on injury, being forced to negotiate with the man she'd tried to destroy. But for him, it wasn't revenge. It was simply fairness. For weeks, she had treated him like he didn't belong, and now she was learning what it felt like to live under someone else's rules. Eventually, the for sale sign appeared in front of 216 Oakwood Drive. Barbara and her husband packed their belongings quietly, moving in the middle of the night to avoid the stares of curious neighbors. No farewell parties, no warm goodbyes. Just the sound of a moving truck rumbling away before dawn. And just like that, the woman who had made his life miserable was gone. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm after that. People still remembered the drama, of course. It wasn't something easily forgotten. But gradually the stares softened, the whispers quieted, and the fences that had felt invisible began to lower. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, he thought back to those first days, the eyes peeking from curtains, the silence that met him on moving day, the endless papers folded neatly in his mailbox. Barbara had wanted to make him feel like an outsider, like he didn't deserve the home he had worked so hard for. And for a time she almost succeeded. But what she didn't understand was that true power doesn't come from rules or titles or intimidation. It comes from knowing who you are, standing firm, and refusing to let anyone take that away. Barbara had built her power on fear. He had built his on truth, and in the end, truth won. As he leaned back in his chair, a soft breeze carrying the sound of children laughing down the street, he smiled. He finally felt at home. Not because the neighborhood had changed overnight, but because he had proven, both to them and to himself, that he belonged here. Some battles are fought with fists, others with words, but the most important ones are fought with patience, proof, and unshakable resolve. And though Barbara was gone, the lesson she left behind remained. For those who watched quietly from the sidelines, it was a reminder of how silence can make you complicit. For those who had joined her whispers, it was a lesson in how quickly power can crumble when built on prejudice. And for him, it was proof that dignity, persistence, and calm strength will always outlast arrogance and fear. The house wasn't just brick and wood anymore. It was a symbol, a place where he stood his ground. claimed his space, and showed that no matter how many notices, complaints, or threats came his way, no one could erase him. He took another sip of his drink, savoring the quiet of the evening. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. It might never be. But it was his, and that was enough because in the end, the story wasn't about Barbara losing. It was about him winning something far more valuable than an argument. He had won peace. He had won respect. He had won his place, and this time no one could take it away.